Today. Stay tuned and watch that during the day. You also stay tuned close to our website, cspan.org, for all the activities that we are going to run today, particularly when it comes to Campaign 2012 issues. Again, that website is cspan.org. The House is in at 10 o'clock this morning for morning hour and just about to come in right now. So we will go to the House of Representatives.
The House will be in order. Pursuant to the order of the House of January 17, 2012, the Chair will now recognize members from lists submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the parties, with each party limited to 1 hour, and each member other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip limited to 5 minutes each, but in no event shall debate continue beyond 11:50 a.m. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Gutierrez, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, we've all seen bad horror movies, the ones where every time you think it's safe to relax and take a deep breath, the monster is right behind the door. You know the drill. No matter how hard the teenagers in the basement or the swimmers at the lake or the hikers in the woods try to get away, the creature just can't be stopped. Well, the people of Puerto Rico are stuck in their very own horror movie, one that just won't end, and one with a villain that just won't go away. Except the villain isn't a guy wearing a hockey mask or carrying a chainsaw. The villain is a bunch of government insiders. And the horror story is about their desire to build a huge gas pipeline. It's a pipeline that the people of Puerto Rico don't want, that experts have said Puerto Rico doesn't need, and environmentalists have testified will destroy the natural beauty of thousands of acres on the island. And this might be the scariest part. It's a pipeline that Puerto Rico doesn't even have enough natural gas to operate. The name of the pipeline is the Gasoducto, and the horror story started in 2010. All about this missing from the script is bad music and vampires. The story has featured the Puerto Rican people's tax dollars, as much as 100 million of them, paid to consultants and lobbyists hired by the government, including close friends and allies of the governor and his ruling party. It's featured the government hiring a consulting team of former high-ranking Army Corps of Engineer employees based in Florida. The consultants magically convinced the Army Corps to take review of the project away from the local San Juan, Puerto Rico office. And where did they move it to? Surprise, to Florida, right down the road from where the consultants live and used to work. It has featured ever-increasing cost estimates of the project, ballooning to nearly $1 billion. It has featured huge protests and marches by Puerto Rican people against the pipeline, and public opinion polls showing 3/4 of Puerto Ricans strongly opposed to the project. It's featured power supply experts who studied the government plan and noticed one important flaw. Just as Casa Pueblo consultants, countless technical experts, environmentalists, and scientists, and I have insisted to the Army Corps all along that the only current source of natural gas supply available for this project in Puerto Rico was too small for a pipeline to even work. And finally, it even featured, after tens of millions of dollars spent, the governor appointing his own commission to make recommendations on how Puerto Rico can make better use of natural gas to meet its energy needs. The commission, appointed by the very governor who dreamt up the Gasoducto plan, made 3 recommendations. None of them, I repeat, were the very Gasoducto, not one. Actually, they discarded it and called it unviable. Finally, the people of Puerto Rico thought the monster must be dead. Finally, we can stop sending tax dollars to connected government insiders. We can stop worrying about our environment. We can stop wondering where in the world the natural gas for $1 billion pipeline will actually come from. But that's not how horror movies work. Last week, the governor was quoted in the press as saying Gasoducto is still alive. Why? Because the governor of Puerto Rico claims that the Assistant Secretary of the Army, who oversees the Army Corps of Engineers, has asked him personally not to withdraw the Gasoducto permit application. Assistant Secretary Darcy wants him, the governor, to wait a while before pulling the plug, which is already on life support for this monster. Personally, I find this hard to believe. I don't know why an Assistant Secretary of the Army would want to keep a monster alive that is unneeded, unwanted, insider boondoggle that isn't even wanted by the regime that proposed it in the first place. But I've written to find out, is it true? And how could this be? And I expect answers, just like I expect answers on my ongoing request to the Army about how the Army Corps of Engineers has handled this application and why the review was moved away from their employees in Puerto Rico to closer to a bunch of consultants who used to head their office in Florida. When it comes to Gasoducto, enough is enough. Like in most bad monster movies, Gasoducto has been almost impossible to believe from the very first scene. A silly, unnecessary waste of time and money. It's time to roll the credits and declare this monster dead once and for all.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Cobble, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unanimous consent to revise and extend, Mr. Speaker.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I stand today to honor the legacy and achievements of one of the greatest friends America's ever known, Mr. Maurice McKinney Moeller, who died recently at the age of 98 in his home country of Denmark. Mr. Moeller, whom I have known personally for more than 2 decades, was a Dane and American by virtue of his American mother, a loyal husband, a doting father, a brilliant businessman, and a leading figure in the development of modern globalized marketplace. I initially met Mr. Moeller, Mr. Speaker, in his Copenhagen office. We spoke for 35 to 40 minutes, and it became apparent to me that I was in the presence of a truly great man. Mr. Moeller loved America. It is no coincidence that his company's U.S. flag business unit, Maersk Lines Limited, owns and operates the largest U.S. flag fleet of vessels serving our military today. In fact, these U.S. flag Maersk vessels employ more American mariners and have delivered more of the critical material to supply U.S. troops in the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts than any other carrier. And the same is true of humanitarian aid and every other category of government-impelled cargo carried by U.S. flagged commercial vessels. Maurice McKinney Moeller believed in the mission and basic goodness of America, and he demonstrated that belief throughout his life. Mr. Moeller, Mr. Speaker, was born in Denmark in 1913. He grew up in the shipping industry that his father, Arnold Peter Moeller, had started in 1904. In 1940, after the occupation of Denmark by Nazi troops, all the company's vessels in international waters were ordered to neutral ports, and a third of the fleet sought refuge in ports controlled by the United States. Mr. Moeller traveled to New York soon after the occupation and ran the operations from there through 1947. Allied forces requisitioned the Maersk fleet and most were subsequently lost to German U-boats in the most devastating loss of merchant mariner life in history. At the conclusion of the war, Mr. Møller returned to Denmark and continued building a global business empire, becoming CEO of the group in 1965. In 1991, Mr. Møller wrote a letter to then U.S. Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney highlighting the long-standing connections between America and Maersk. Among other matters in the letter, Mr. Møller wrote, quote, "Maersk is and always has been a strong advocate for uninhibited free trade and the principles of freedom consistently enunciated by the United States and Denmark. Our entire organization, and especially Maersk Line Limited, will be ready to serve any time should that be desired," close quote. Mr. Møller stepped down as CEO in 1993, but remained chairman of the A.P. Møller Group until 2003. Even through the last few months of his life, however, Mr. Møller went to work every day, walking up 5 flights of stairs to his office. Through his vision and leadership, Mr. Møller built the largest container shipping company in the world, but never abandoned his love and appreciation for the United States and its people. Over 70 years, he personally cultivated and sustained a valuable partnership with the United States, one that continues to support and advance our commercial and national security interests around the world. Finally, Mr. Møller was a citizen of Denmark, indeed the world, but he will always have a special place of respect, admiration, and appreciation from the people and the government of the United States. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In this time of extreme weather events, our hearts go out to victims of the storms, wildfires, power outages, torrential downpours, the winds, trees crashing into homes. It makes our heart ache thinking of the suffering of hundreds of thousands of people in sweltering heat without electricity. Beyond our shores, we see this extreme weather is global in scale, such as the flash floods that killed hundreds in Russia this last week. We must pause, shudder, feel sadness for those families. For many, the instinct is to help people resettle, rebuild, and reconnect. But the nation's elected leaders should do more than comfort those in distress and try to help people recover. As policymakers, shouldn't we act to try and prevent the next catastrophe? Some of this is relatively simple and straightforward, even if potentially controversial. Don't relocate people back in the same flame or flood zone. We know they'll be ravaged by fire and flood. At a minimum, we shouldn't have the federal government pay to put people right back in harm's way. This discussion is part of flood insurance reform and national disaster policy that I've personally been working on for decades. We've made some progress, but not nearly what we should. You would think we would stop making it worse, yet we allow more and more people to move into the flame zone, seeking to live with nature, and these people then expect government to prevent nature from doing what it's done for eons. In most cases, the fires in these areas not only cannot be stopped, but we make the next fire worse by suppressing nature's natural fire cycle until there's so much fuel in the forest that the inevitable next fire burns longer and more furiously, putting more at risk. The more people who are permitted or even encouraged to build homes and live in an area that cannot be defended is a prescription for disaster. It's an example of political malpractice, a head-in-the-sand attitude that many today in this chamber have regarding climate change, rising sea level, and weather instability, which are all completely predictable, foreseen consequences of carbon pollution. It's being played out in a variety of areas. We're watching oceans become more acidic, bleaching and killing coral reefs, which are the rainforests of the sea. Shouldn't we be doing something to try and prevent it? On the land, it's becoming clear what warming will mean to our communities with more instability, hotter temperatures, heavier precipitation events. 23,383 all-time heat records this year. The worst example of government response, I think, is legislation in North Carolina that's already passed the state Senate and working its way through that would prevent the state and local governments from planning based on the best scientific evidence about the accelerating pace of sea level increase. In Congress, it's notable that one of our major parties has firm opposition to even using the word climate change, let alone plan for it happening. It's not an energy policy to promote more carbon pollution and lavish support for old fossil fuel technology, or to claim climate science is a hoax. That's the mindset that put at risk replacement of a vitally needed satellite providing climate data. With all the ominous signs, horrific events, and high stakes, how can we as policymakers not at least give weight to the advice of the vast majority of scientists? I'll tell you, this current generation of politicians will be asked by their grandchildren, what could you possibly have been thinking? Indeed, I'll wager that some of today's policymakers, even the most obtuse and dogmatic, will live long enough to regret their hostility to science and their short-sighted devotion to politics of the moment over the future of the planet and of their very families. They are like King Canute, who ordered the tide not to come in until it washed over his feet. Unlike King Canute, today's policymakers could do something about it.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Forbes, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, several days ago, I was one of only a handful of members of Congress who actually sat in the Supreme Court and listened to 5 justices debate and say that they believed that the President's health tax was constitutional, and I watched them debate the 4 justices who believed it was not constitutional. And because one more justice believed it was constitutional than the 4 that believed it was not constitutional, our friends on the other side of the aisle believe that we should now step back and do nothing and just allow this health tax to be imposed on the American people. Well, we reject that suggestion. And the reason we do is because today the #1 issue in the American people's minds is the economy, and the #1 concern they have about the economy is the loss of their jobs. And yet we have watched as this administration has had 41 straight months of unemployment in excess of 8%. We have watched as their policies have delivered us a net loss of 473,000 jobs. And we are about to unleash 3 enormous job killers on the American public. In just a few months, we will increase taxes on the American people if we refuse to extend the Bush tax cuts, which will cost thousands of jobs. And yet our friends on the other side of the aisle say we should step back and do nothing, and we reject that notion. In just a few months, based on legislation this President approved and signed into law, we will have massive defense cuts that his own Secretary of Defense says will cost us 1.5 million jobs. And our friends on the other side of the aisle say we should do nothing and just let that come on the American people. We reject that notion. And finally, Mr. Speaker, as this health tax gets ready to be imposed on the American people, based on the Congressional Budget Office, it will cost 800,000 jobs. And yet our friends on the other side of the aisle say we should take no action and just let it happen. We reject that notion. And the reason we reject it is because the American people realize that as we take an action to repeal this health tax, we are setting a new course for health care in America. And as we set a new course for health care in America, we begin to do what the American people want us to do and set a new course and a new direction for America. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Boy, my friend from Virginia could not be more wrong. What exactly are the House Republicans trying to accomplish with today's 32nd repeal vote of health care? One of the first votes Republicans brought to the floor when they became the majority in January of 2011, was to repeal the health care insurance reform in its entirety. That bill passed out of the House in a virtual party line vote, so you'd think Republicans would move on to the real challenges facing our economy, like unemployment and the expiration of individual and business tax cuts. In the face of the Supreme Court ruling declaring health insurance protections in the Affordable Care Act constitutional, House Republicans are not repealing that earlier vote, but instead setting up to repeat it. They've become so ideologically immovable that they can think of no more constructive solution than to simply replay this bit of political theater. 56% of Americans say it's time to move on to the true pressing challenges facing our nation, according to the Kaiser Family Foundation poll. A quick review of those challenges shows that the Republican House majority has not even tried to address them. Let's start with the very real threat of expiring tax cuts, creating a drag in our economy. There are actually a number of already expired or expiring tax cuts, including the alternative minimum tax patch, which could affect 34 million Americans. Then there's the payroll tax cut affecting 160 million Americans and numerous businesses, including the Bush tax cuts, which expire later this year. All combined, the expiration of those tax cuts could add up to a $4,000 per household bill on Americans. So far, the House Republicans haven't felt the urgency to hold a single vote to extend any of those tax cuts. How about the Medicare doc fix? If Congress doesn't extend the sustainable growth rate patch, Medicare and TRICARE doctors will see more than a 27% cut in their reimbursements, causing many of them to stop seeing patients. Millions of seniors and military members and retirees could lose access to their doctors. Not a single vote has been proposed by the Republicans to stop that from happening. Then there's the debt ceiling. Without action, the nation will once again risk breaching its statutory limit, triggering a historic default. Last summer, we achieved a bipartisan agreement to raise that ceiling and lower the deficit at the same time, warding off the cataclysmic effects of default, but not before House Republicans pushed us to the brink, resulting in the first time ever downgrading of U.S. credit. The American people don't want a repeat of that sad chapter in our history, and our economy certainly cannot afford it. Ronald Reagan knew the value of ensuring America fulfilled its commitments. He raised the debt ceiling 18 times with no conditionality. What about a comprehensive jobs bill? After 27 straight months of private sector job growth, cleaning up the mess President Obama inherited, the pace of U.S. job creation has begun to slow in the wake of instability in European markets. Before the July 4th holiday, we achieved a rare feat for this Congress in passing a bipartisan reauthorization of the transportation bill, giving a much-needed jolt to the construction sector. But we can and should do more to spur hiring in the alternative energy sector, manufacturing, health care, and more. But instead of focusing on jobs, which they claimed in the last election was their focus, Republicans are creating a sense of deja vu all over again on the floor by staging a repeat of the health care reform. Last in this political pandering is the fact that the Affordable Care Act is actually working. Seniors who fall in the prescription drug donut hole saving an average of $651 this year alone. Almost 13 million Americans are eligible for rebates, averaging $151 from their insurance companies, thanks to new requirements in the bill. Premiums for Medicare Advantage are down 7% for the first time ever, and benefits are up, and enrollment is up 10%. And Medicare is on track to save $200 billion by 2016, pursuant to the Act, without one benefit being cut. In fact, benefits improving. Mr. Speaker, the House majority is selectively ignoring those improvements to justify this repeat of its repeal vote. With so much to do, with American businesses and families waiting for tax predictability, with the economy bracing for the impending fiscal cliff, with almost 4 million people still searching for employment, House Republicans are simply offering more of the same. And sadly, it's not enough. Americans need real solutions to real problems. Let's get on with them.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I come back on the floor, as I have almost weekly throughout this entire Congress of 2 years, to talk about the issue of high-level nuclear waste. And what are we to do about it. And I really applaud my colleagues who joined me on June 6, 2012 on an amendment to a spending bill. And it was a bipartisan vote. 326 members of Congress supported finishing the scientific study on Yucca Mountain. That's the money that we had appropriated that Senator Reid and President Obama did not spend the money for the scientific study. Then in the last two cycles, Senator Reid has been blocking additional money for finishing the scientific study. 228 Republicans joined me, 98 Democrats joined me, and to really stress the point that we've got to finish this. This is Yucca Mountain's been started in 1982 with the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. It was the defined location. It is the defined location under current law under the amendments passed in 1987. To not fulfill and not to move forward is, in my estimation, breaking the law of the land. And who's complicit in this is our friends on the other side and the President of the United States. Now, so what is that? How does that affect the rest of the nation and the senators involved and members involved? Well, we compare the current site of Yucca Mountain to where nuclear waste is located around this country. Yucca Mountain currently has no nuclear waste on site. We've already spent $15 billion over 20 years trying to finish this project. It would be stored 1,000 feet underground. It would be 1,000 feet above the water table, and it would be 100 miles from the Colorado River. Well, let's look at where we have nuclear waste. And nuclear waste is defined by a lot of different titles. Some is just spent fuel from our nuclear utilities. A lot of our nuclear waste is defense waste. Reprocessed, weaponized uranium, or the chemicals needed to affect that. So we have a Department of Energy location, Idaho National Labs. How much waste is in Idaho right now? We've got 5,090 canisters on site. Waste is stored above the ground and in pools. Waste is 500 feet above the water table, and waste is 50 miles from Yellowstone National Park, a major tourist destination for many of our citizens throughout this country. So then we look at this is a Senate issue, really not a House issue anymore, since the House is on record, especially with this vote this year of 326 of our colleagues in support. Where are the senators? The last time I came down the floor, I talked about the state of Missouri and Senator McCaskill undecided after being a U.S. Senator for 5.5 years. Well, now I turn to Montana, who's a neighbor to Idaho, and another undecided senator, Senator Jon Tester. Can you imagine being a U.S. Senator for 5.5 years, having nuclear waste in the state next to you, and never have a position on what do we do with the final position on nuclear waste, whether it's nuclear waste in spent fuel or whether it's nuclear waste in our defense industry? A place like Hanford, Washington, where we have millions of gallons of toxic nuclear waste that's designed to go to Yucca Mountain. Couldn't a U.S. Senator in 5.5 years say, I think yes or I think no? Well, why is that important? You look at the total tally of what we've done over the past year and a half trying to identify where senators stand. We have 55 senators who support moving forward on Yucca Mountain. We have 22 question marks, one of them being Senator Tester from Montana. And then we have 23 identified no votes. Really, to close debate, based upon the Senate rules, you need 60. If we can move Senator McCaskill and Senator Tester, that brings us to 57 senators, and really a game-changing position to resolve this issue of high-level nuclear waste, which is pretty much throughout the entire country. In my own state, my colleagues here on the floor with us on the state of Illinois, we are the largest nuclear generating state in the country. We have 6 locations, 11 reactors, some right on Lake Michigan. Wisconsin, nuclear power plants right on Lake Michigan. Michigan, nuclear power plants right on Lake Michigan. I mean, would you rather have high-level nuclear waste in the desert underneath a mountain, or would you rather have it next to Lake Michigan or 50 miles from Yellowstone National Park? I think the answer is simple. This has become politicized because of the majority leader of the Senate and his partner in crime, the President of the United States. It's time for us to move on good public policy. identify, centrally locate, and store high-level nuclear waste underneath a mountain in a desert. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Baldwin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thanks to the Affordable Care Act, roughly 17 million American children with pre-existing medical conditions can no longer be discriminated against, be denied health insurance by insurance companies. And yet, rather than bringing focus to the key tasks of creating jobs and strengthening the middle class in America, my Republican colleagues want to tear up the health care law. They want to rip up the independent decision by our Supreme Court, by justices appointed by presidents of both parties, finding the Affordable Care Act is on firm constitutional footing. And they want to start all over again, putting the coverage of those millions of children I just spoke about at risk. This vote is personal. Health care is personal. When I was 9, I had a serious childhood illness. I spent 3 months in the hospital. My grandparents, who were raising me, found that their family insurance didn't cover me. They made great sacrifices to help pay for my care. But if that weren't enough, when my grandparents then looked for insurance that would cover me, they couldn't find coverage at any price. I was considered one of those kids with a pre-existing medical condition. Never mind that I had fully recovered from my illness. No child should ever be denied coverage for that reason. I grew up believing that no family should have to go through what ours did. Parents or grandparents shouldn't have to worry, shouldn't have to lay awake at night worrying about whether they can provide for a sick child or whether an illness might bankrupt their family. Families now know that insurance companies can't discriminate against their children based on a pre-existing condition. Turning back the clock so insurance companies can once again deny children access to care is simply wrong. It is time that we all move forward. It is time that we work together. It is time to make this Affordable Care Act work for the American people. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite talk of political gridlock in D.C., Republicans and Democrats can agree on at least one thing. The economy is in rough shape. For the past 41 months, the unemployment rate has not gone below 8%, causing worry, uncertainty, and frustration for many families living in Michigan and across the U.S. But unfortunately, things can still get worse. It's time for President Obama and the Senate to stop pushing their failed agendas and start applying common-sense policies that work. My Republican colleagues and I in the House have been listening to the American people and remain committed to policies that spur job creation, reduce costs, and restore power back to the people. Last month's employment report showed that millions of Americans still are without a job, and the unemployment rate is stuck at 8.2%. Meanwhile, the anemic job growth is even worse in my district, where some areas show an unemployment rate of over 9%. Nationwide, the rate of real unemployment, which includes the unemployed, the underemployed, and those that want to work but have given up looking, now totals 14.9%. Making matters worse, the number of weeks it takes a worker to find a job has more than doubled since President Obama took office. Is this hope and change? But it's not just the unemployment numbers which paint a grim picture of our economy. Government spending is out of control. With 84 days left in the fiscal year, the government has already spent its way into another $1 trillion deficit. Despite this out-of-control spending, the Senate hasn't bothered to pass a budget in more than 3 years. Since that time, the federal government has added more than $4 trillion to our national debt. Families, businesses in my district and across the country know that they can't spend more than they make, which is why they create budgets and why they sometimes have to make tough choices to prevent from drowning in debt. They get it, but sadly their President and Senate still refuse to look at the facts. But they also refuse to listen to the American people. According to the polls, Americans, and especially those in my district, are angry about having a government takeover of health care and the largest tax increase in history. Health care coverage is already too expensive for many families in my district, and this health care takeover will not only make it more expensive, but put federal bureaucracy between them and their doctor. On top of that, it'll hinder job creators from hiring by requiring them to either offer costly government-mandated health insurance or pay a steep fine. So far, my colleagues and I in the House have taken 30 floor votes to repeal, defund, and dismantle the law. After it's gone, we can start over with common-sense reforms that will return choices to the patients and not burden job creators with higher costs, new regulations, and more uncertainty. It's obvious to the American people that the President's policies are failing and making the economy worse. Instead, they want the government to stop taxing them more, stop creating new harmful regulations, and stop coming between them and their doctor. House Republicans have been listening. That's why we will continue to work on repealing this unfavorable and costly health care law. It's why we already put forth a balanced, responsible budget, and it's why we put together a plan for Americans' job creators, to create an environment in which small businesses can grow and hire, and where health care is affordable again. Currently, there are 27 bipartisan jobs bills that have been passed by the House and are languishing in the Democrat-controlled Senate. My hope is that the President and Senate stop talking to the American people and start listening to them. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Woolsey, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Another day, Mr. Speaker, another wave of attacks by insurgents in Afghanistan. The New York Times reported yesterday that the Taliban killed 5 police officers with a roadside bomb in what it calls a relatively peaceful province in central Afghanistan. Separate attacks in Kandahar led to the deaths of 3 officers with 6 civilians wounded. A motorcycle bomb took the lives of several more people in Helmand province on Sunday night. And then yet another motorcycle bomb in northern Afghanistan on Monday, wounding 26 with 10 in critical condition. And a deeply disturbing video is making its way around the internet, showing a 22-year-old Afghan woman being brutally executed by the Taliban over accusations of adultery. Almost 11 years after our military occupation began, the security situation in Afghanistan is clearly abysmal. Our troops are in danger. Afghan security forces are in danger. Innocent civilians are in danger. Nearly 11 years ago, we went to war with the goal of defeating the Taliban, and yet the Taliban is alive and well, winning recruits, operating in the shadows, and ruling by terror throughout Afghanistan. I'm not saying that ending the war and bringing our troops home will stabilize Afghanistan overnight, but I am saying that the longer we continue with our military occupation, the more we breathe life into the very forces we're trying to defeat. It is the resentment of our boots on the ground that is helping to sustain the Taliban. There are clearly urgent humanitarian needs in Afghanistan, Mr. Speaker, and we have a moral responsibility to help meet them. This is one of the poorest nations on earth with infrastructure needs, children who need schools, and malnutrition that must be addressed. But deploying thousands and thousands of troops for more than a decade is not the way to meet these challenges. Our military is not trained or equipped to do that kind of work. For pennies on the dollar, Mr. Speaker, we can have a true civilian surge, investing in development aid to improve the lives of the Afghan people. We could give USAID a fraction of the $10 billion a month we spend on the war in Afghanistan, and we could do a world of good. This approach isn't just the right thing to do. It isn't just a moral imperative. It's the smart national security strategy as well. On the other hand, the existing strategy of invasion and occupation has not served us well. The Afghanistan war has cost us dearly in precious lives, in taxpayer dollars, in moral authority and global credibility. It's undermining our national security interests instead of advancing them. Mr. Speaker, it's time to do the smart thing. Bring our troops home and in return invest in the hopes and future of the Afghan people. And to do it now, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Indiana prison inmate Ryan Grimminger collected unemployment benefits during his 2-year sentence in the county jail for a drug crime. He collected $14,000 of taxpayer money. He was in jail and the government continued to pay him anyway. Only in America would we pay people in jail because they are unemployed. Grimminger should not have obtained money from honest American taxpayers, but he did. Government is becoming incompetent when it comes to paying unemployment benefits. According to CNN, the federal government overpaid $14 billion in unemployment benefits just last year. That means 11% of all jobless benefits paid out were not supposed to be paid to those individuals. Those overpayments that should have gone to people in need were sent by government to those who didn't deserve any money. You see, not all payments are to honest people who are looking for jobs and are out of work. Inmate Grimminger's case is bad, but there's more. A convicted killer, murderer in a California prison was receiving at least $30,000 in unemployment checks. The murderer made sure that his family and his friends cashed his checks while he was locked up. So each month, his family fraudulently cashed his $1,600 check, which they would then deposit in his jail bank account. Guess where it went next, Mr. Speaker? He shared the jail money with some of his low-life prison gang members while he was in the joint. There's more. The federal government reportedly sent a man $515,000 in payments over 37 years. 37 years, Mr. Speaker, because he was supposedly unemployed. 37 years of unemployment benefits for anyone is nonsense to me, but who exactly were they sending that money to in this case? A dead person who died 40 years ago. No wonder he wasn't working, Mr. Speaker. He wasn't around. We count on our government to spend our tax dollars wisely, but it inefficiently is sending money to those not qualified to obtain taxpayer support. Prison inmates and dead people. $14 billion is a lot of money in anybody's book. In the private sector, if a business misappropriated $14 billion, the people in charge would be fired or go to jail. But not so with government agencies. These overpayments and wasteful, incompetent spending really don't shock or surprise Americans anymore at all. There is so much waste of taxpayer money that we have become accustomed to it, and we actually expect government to waste money. Too big, too wasteful, too incompetent, and too inefficient. But the real problem is not waste, but the size and inefficiency of government. We're moving to a society that is just another European nanny state where government is bigger, bloated, and controlling. The government says it will provide all our needs if we just turn over more power, authority, and money to government and government agencies.
Now, Mr. Speaker, does anybody ever really get warm fuzzies when we hear about government programs like the Post Office, FEMA, the IRS, or TSA? I don't think so. Government doesn't do things better, it does things more expensively and wastefully. And government promotes a concept of more dependence on government, not independence. We in Congress need to realize the obvious, that unlimited, out-of-control government is not the answer to our problems. But until we get a grip on government and move to a constitutional concept of limited government, we should expect and demand more accountability from the people that are in charge of the people's money. With hard economic times affecting the unemployed, we cannot tolerate wasteful spending by government bureaucracies. 8.5% unemployment nationwide, 11% in the Hispanic community, 14% in the African American community, 14% for returning military from Iraq and Afghanistan, and 50% unemployment for recent college graduates. We should demand that when government helps those we as a society say it should help, government does so properly and efficiently and in a dignified way. Otherwise, more dead people will continue to receive taxpayer money that should go to people that are at least alive. And that's just the way it is. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The passage and implementation of the Affordable Care Act is the culmination of an American political journey that started a century ago with Teddy Roosevelt in 1912 with the Bull Moose Party, also a Republican, and picked up years later by Harry Truman and other presidents, including Richard Nixon, another Republican. The most recent groundwork for reform was laid in part by the former Republican presidential candidate Robert Dole as an alternative to Hillary Clinton's plan, and by the present Republican presidential nominee Mitt Romney. I commend them for championing the concept of the individual mandate, back when it wasn't quite as unpopular on their side of the aisle. The history of reforming our nation's healthcare system is a strong one that has historically been championed by lawmakers on both sides of the political spectrum until this Congress. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle have wasted hours upon hours debating and voting upon the various versions of the legislation that would repeal the Affordable Care Act. My colleagues know that these initiatives are fruitless. They know that voting over and over and over again, more than 30 times total, on measures to repeal the Affordable Care Act is a waste of time. But they keep calling for these votes. Do you want to know why? Because they want to distract the American public from the fact that they are so committed to unseating our President, Barack Obama, that they haven't passed any effective jobs-creating legislation since they took the majority of this House in 2010. The Supreme Court of the United States upheld the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act, and it's time to face the facts. Earlier today, a gentleman from Virginia said, oh, it was just 5-4. Bush v. Gore was 5-4. We accepted that the person who got the least votes and lost Florida was President of the United States for 8 years, for the consequences we still have to face. But the Affordable Care Act is the law of the land, and as a result, millions of Americans who were previously uninsured or underinsured have access to affordable, high-quality health care. In fact, the number of Americans uninsured is equal to the population of 25 of the 50 states. Thanks to the Affordable Care Act, millions of Americans and small businesses have already benefited from lower health care costs, increased access to preventative care, and stronger patient protections. Thanks to the Affordable Care Act, 12.8 million families will receive rebates that total over $1 billion from insurers next month in August, because the law requires companies to provide value for the premium dollar. Never before has that happened. Community health centers in my district have received over $10 million to deliver health care services to underserved and impoverished Memphians. 170,000 households in my district will get a premium credit so they can afford quality health insurance coverage. Women no longer are considered a pre-existing condition, and insurance companies can't charge them more, which they did by 40%. Medicare beneficiaries now have access to preventative care and services without any copay. 64,000 people in my district will go from uninsured to insured. 32.5 million seniors nationwide received one or more preventative care treatments in 2011. And the donut hole is being closed. 50% discounts on covered brand name generics. Annual and lifetime caps on health care coverage are now illegal, meaning insurance companies can't kick you off the plan just because you get cancer or in an accident or have a heart attack.
Our children are now protected because insurers are prevented from denying coverage to children under 19 for pre-existing conditions. This means up to 17 million children with pre-existing conditions are now protected from discrimination. Young adults can remain on their parents' insurance till they're 26, providing some protection in this uncertain job market. It's now affordable for small businesses to provide insurance to employees. The tax credits cover up to 35% of the cost of coverage and will go up to 50% in 2014. In fact, in 2011, 360,000 small employees used the Small Business Health Care Tax Credit to help them afford health insurance for 2 million workers. One of the most misleading arguments by my colleagues concerns that the penalty will be assessed on those financially able Americans who choose not to purchase insurance, thereby not taking responsibility for their health care. Responsibility, that's one of the keynotes of the Republican side. But if an uninsured person in my district gets into a car accident or comes down with an aggressive illness, they're taken to a public hospital in Memphis called the Med. The Med treats everybody because they have to. And when the Med takes care of those people, the property tax owners, the responsible people, pay for it through higher property taxes. Or you pay through it through insurance if you have it because it's uncompensated care if you go to a non-public hospital. The time and effort put in by nurses and doctors and assistants at the Med aren't free. The medical devices and supplies that the Med used to treat those uninsured people aren't free. Every single resident of Shelby County pays for those services when a person seeks emergency services there, and the taxes go up. People who choose not to buy insurance for themselves and their families, even with the federal government providing incentives and credits, who do so are irresponsible free riders. And it's the free riders that the other side's trying to talk about, not the conscientious and responsible people who take control of their own lives and their own destinies. Not taking responsibility for the health of yourself and your family is reckless. The free riders have been a burden on our national health care system for far too long, and it's time they take responsibility for their actions and their health. This penalty, which will be equal to no more than an estimated cost of insurance premium, is the way we do it. It's long past time we implement the health reform initiated by Teddy Roosevelt and championed by people of both parties. It's time Americans realize and take advantage of the right to quality health care. And it's past time my colleagues stop playing partisan politics and start working on behalf of the American people, not giant corporations once again. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Doak, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, this week I welcomed 26 new citizens to this country. It was an inspirational event, and I'm so proud that all they have been able to accomplish. These individuals have worked hard to become citizens, and they are poised to go on and fulfill the American dream. There is no doubt that times are tough, and yet these individuals have persevered despite all of the obstacles. As families all over the nation are struggling with a lagging economy, we must remain focused on job creation and economic growth. As part of my Main Street Jobs agenda, I'm focused on bringing opportunities such as STEM education for our students and for those looking for work. As part of this effort, I've co-sponsored the bipartisan bicameral Startup 2.0 Act. The United States is the higher education destination for the world. This is a testament to the strength of these institutions and the value of the degrees. But too often, foreign students come here to learn and then have little choice but to return to their home countries after they are through. Students with advanced degrees in science and technology, engineering and mathematics are forced to go home with that knowledge, with the ideas and aspirations to change the world and bring new technologies. Many of them want to stay here, to make something of themselves here in our country, because it is still the best place for ideas to become realities. And what we do is we force them to go back to their own country, to compete against us here in the United States. These ideas become solutions, which in turn become job-creating companies. According to a study by the National Foundation for American Policy, immigrants founded or co-founded almost half of the top 50 venture-backed companies in the United States. Since our nation's founding, Mr. Speaker, immigrants have flourished along with our economy. America becomes a richer and more dynamic society by encouraging the best and the brightest from all over the world to set up shop here on our soil. That is why I'm honored to co-sponsor the bipartisan bicameral Startup 2.0 Act that will help get Americans back to work, and I encourage my colleagues to do the same. America becomes a richer and more dynamic society by encouraging the best and the brightest from all over the world to come here to our country.
The people I welcomed as new citizens this week do not have time for gridlock in Washington, Mr. Speaker. The American public don't have time for gridlock in Washington. We must move forward and find common ground to help the millions of Americans who are looking towards their American dream, to help them get back to work. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, pardon me. Mr. Speaker, this message is only for persons who may get sick. If you will never get sick, this message is not for you. N-O-T, not for you. Only for those who will get sick. Mr. Speaker, I hold in my left hand a copy of the Affordable Care Act. I hold in my right hand the replacement bill that my colleagues across the aisle have been talking about. This bill has passed the Congress of the United States of America. It is more than 2,000 pages. It was condemned for being too long, which may explain the size of this bill. This bill has within it preventive care. This bill has within it a cap on administrative costs. You must spend 80 to 85% of the money that insurance companies collect on health care. This bill protects persons who are under 26 years of age as they can stay on their parents' insurance. This bill covers persons with pre-existing conditions. I had to read this bill. My constituents insisted that I read this bill before voting on it. And my constituents want me to read this bill. This is the replacement bill, and they want me to be sure that I understand the replacement bill before I vote to repeal. So what I'd like to do now, for all within the sound of my voice and who are viewing this, I want to read the replacement bill. I shall read the replacement bill. Let me just read half of it first. I shall now read one half of the replacement bill. Now I shall read the other half of the replacement bill. Now some of you will say, Al, you read too fast. I didn't pick up all of that. So for those who listen slowly, or those who may have missed it, I shall now read the replacement bill in its entirety. That's the replacement bill. Here is the bill that we can read. I'm going to ask that I be allowed to place the replacement bill in the record. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I ask that persons consider the empirical evidence as well as the invisible evidence. When you weigh the empirical evidence against the invisible evidence, you decide whether we should vote to repeal. Now, there may be some who contend, well, Al, really, I'd just like to go back to the way things were. Let's quickly go back to the way things were. Gladys Knight had a song styled The Way We Were. Here is the way we were in '09. In '09, when we were considering replacement, we were spending $2.5 trillion a year on health care. That's a big number, hard to get your mind around it. That's $79,000 a second. It was, at that time, 17.6% of GDP. We were spending $100 billion a year on persons who were uninsured. It was projected that by 2018 we'd spend $4.4 trillion, which would have been 20.3% of GDP, which is $139,000 a second. In my state of Texas, we had 6 million people who were uninsured. In Harris County, where I have my congressional district, we had 1.1 million people who were uninsured. 20% of the state's children were uninsured. 50% of Americans were uninsured. 45,000 persons per year were dying because of a lack of insurance. That's one person every 12 minutes. And if you don't like that, call Harvard. I got the statistics from Harvard. The system was not sustainable. This is why we embarked upon producing this bill. So I beg that those who insisted that I read this bill before voting, please understand that before you vote, you ought to read this bill and compare the two. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair will now recognize the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Hayworth, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a frequent rider and former commuter on New York's mass transit system, I know how important public transportation is. The New York Metropolitan Transportation Authority, or MTA, alone transports more than 8.5 million commuters across metropolitan New York every day. In the district I'm privileged to serve, New York's 19th Congressional District, which includes Westchester, Orange, Rockland, Dutchess, and Putnam counties, the MTA's 31 Metro-North Railroad stations serve 11,000 passengers every day. Every weekday, I should say. Our Hudson Valley's mass transit commuters lost part of their recent tax credit for employer-provided mass transit benefits as of January 1st of this year. Commuters utilizing the mass transit portion have seen their credit drop from $230 per month to $125 per month, which means that their commuting costs have increased. In contrast, commuters utilizing the driving and parking benefit have seen an automatic increase from $230 per month to $240 per month. That's why I introduced the Commuter Savings Act on June 29th. This legislation would extend parity between the mass transit and parking portions of the transportation tax credit. That would increase mass transit benefits from $125 per month to $240 per month. Mass transit minimizes traffic congestion, reduces fuel consumption, and limits wear and tear on our roads and bridges. It's really a great win for all of us, even if we don't use mass transit. So the Commuter Savings Act will directly help more than 70,000 of our Hudson Valley neighbors. And the bill is retroactive to January 1st of this year, which will provide mass transit commuters with a full 2 years of certainty in their mass transit benefits. For the tens of thousands of Hudson Valley residents and millions of Americans across the country who rely on safe and affordable public transportation, and for all of us who enjoy the benefits of those fellow Americans using mass transit, I urge my colleagues to join me and my fellow primary co-sponsors, Representatives Peter King and Bob Dole, in giving our mass transit commuters a break in these tough economic times. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Ellison, for 5 minutes.